Hi, I'm Shlabs, visiting from Yale University.
I'm Nicole Li, and I'm graduating this year from MArc 1.
And we're here to talk about stuff. There's a lot of stuff around the SCI-Arc building today. Maybe you want to talk about some of the stuff that you brought for your project. There's got to be some reason why they chose you to talk about stuff.
I have stuff is like thrown to me as a topic because I have a lot of stuff in terms of my study models. So I'm going to actually start with how I kind of started my thesis. It's this Duer's polyhedron that I like from his etching. So I kind of trace, this kind of each face in Rhino space, and then build it into like a 3D object for my own, like a stuff. And then,
yeah, one of the things that I thought was really interesting about this this model. I mean, I've long been familiar with like Duer's melancholy, the etching that you extracted this polyhedron from, and the thing that's remarkable about that particular object, I mean, along with the sphere that's in that etching too, right, is it's more or less scaleless. It's kind of pure geometry. It exists outside the realm of materiality or other associations, and a lot of the work that you did for your thesis project plays with this notion of scale, notion of object, thing versus model, how things are contextualized, recontextualized. And your first move with this was to give it a kind of, was to etch your own pattern into it, this kind of brickwork pattern, which gives it scale, right? It immediately suggests that this is not a sort of object of like absolute pure geometry without scale, without context, but it's a model of something bigger, right?
Right. So starting from there, I guess I actually source a lot of my materials from Daiso. It's like a dollar store nearby, and then starting to play with just the material and see how they can be folded and wrapped, and like say like a sack of potatoes, how that can be as a building. So I started like doing a lot of collages too for just to drop it onto the side. So the scale, when you see it in the image, the scale automatically change from from this to a building size.
Are these? Oh wait, these aren't actual potatoes though. They just look like potatoes.
This
right?
look like potatoes.
See, like this sort of thing happened. This happened all day yesterday, and especially with your project. I know that this is a set of objects. It looks like pantyhose stuffed with something fuzzy, something soft. You've got this kind of little binder clip on it, and yet when you take this object, right, this thing, this kind of conglomeration of stuff, and you place it in a kind of collage where you look at it relative to the skyline of Chicago, suddenly it becomes a model for a building.
Right.
But what's really fascinating about it is it resists that reading, right? It's not the kind of architectural model that seeks to replicate at a smaller scale all the details of built architecture, like finished building. It is really self-conscious about the fact that it's being held together with a binder clip. So when you're talking about oh, what's the joinery, what's the material? It's well, we can have that conversation about material analogy, a kind of formal or scalar translation, transposition. But at the end of the day, it's a bunch of stuffed pantyhose. But you called it a sack of potatoes, right? So it carries with it this whole suite of associations, which kind of resists its intellectual translation into architecture, which is what I think is so fascinating about it,
Yeah, and then moving forward, I also use different materials, but I guess this too also, like cups. And say, for example, this one here, I was thinking when I was reading it, maybe the white is as a placeholder, it kind of, but when it's thickened, it can be a public space, and whatever stuff inside can be a private space. So when you see them together, right now it looks like this, but I think there's a lot of architecture opportunities from
No,
that.
I mean, I totally agree. I mean, I think, on the other hand, right, if I'm an architect, you're an architect, we're in an architecture school, I think just the fact that we're looking at this in this context, right? This makes it a model for a building. If this were out on the street, right, or if this were my son's kindergarten class or something else, I wouldn't immediately assume that this serves as both a scale model of architecture and as a kind of assemblage unto itself. With tape as the binder and these kind of scrubbing sponges and these kind of paper coffee cups.
Yeah.
That to me is what's really fascinating. Now, when your project made the leap though to and this is kind of a middle ground. It made the leap to, you know, what you might call like capital A architecture. You've got like a section model, it's got windows, it's got all of these sort of elements that lend it a kind of architectural scale. The conversation even lead towards like, you know, what's this building made out of? And you have this really delightful model. You're using this kind of like plastic film, right? I mean, this is just kind of like plastic film. You've got safety pins. You've like really kind of like lovingly kind of stitched it in places. For me, it's not where the project failed, but it's where the kind of process of investigation you set off on kind of got ahead of itself. I mean, like, what was that like to kind of take this and, you know, I think it's altogether easy to say like, okay, now this is kind of architecture. I'm going to take exactly this form, and the visual form is the only thing that matters. But for me, what really matters about this is not just the visual form. It is the literal material quality of the stuff that you made out of. So what was that like to kind of make the leap from, which I think was a kind of radical leap, from the sack of potatoes with the binder clips or like the plastic film, and then have to do like section drawings and elevation drawings and kind of plan drawings?
So I guess when I was studying this model, I was thinking there are a lot of qualities that from, you know, compared to the sack with potatoes or something else. Specifically for this one here, I'm not sure if you can see it, but all the skin is like thickened with stuff inside. So when I was making my model, I was thinking, oh, this, you know, can actually be something. So this can actually be something that's thickened and like stuff with program, and also the stuff inside as well, like they can be, yeah, just programmatic, like, you know,
right.
Space.
Right. So that analogy is there. It's like inherent in the project. It's just the jump for me was like abrupt. I feel like as intricate and incredible and detailed as your analysis was, and you know, we can't look at. We have the luxury. I have the luxury of actually looking at your project on the wall back behind the camera, so I can speak to this sort of like suite of like sketches. You know, and the sketch is another type of architectural drawing, which is both nothing and everything. Right? It's the alpha and omega of like architectural design. It is just a scribble on a paper, on a piece of paper. We know it's just a scribble on a piece of paper, yet at the same time, it contains the kernel of everything that's going to come after. And you know, the remarkable thing about the sketch too is like we don't look at it as a kind of as an architectural convention necessarily, as a kind of scaled thing. Among architectural drawings, I think the sketch is privileged in as much as it is more or less scaleless. At least the really successful ones for me. You know, Frank Gehry's sketches are really famous for this. Frank Gehry's sketches exist as kind of compositions in their own right at the scale of ink on paper, but they also exist at the scale of, you know, the Guggenheim Bilbao.
Right.
Right. But back to this issue of like scale. I mean, your work, especially the kind of collages you put together where your various models are kind of placed in Chicago on kind of a real site. They're like blown up to architectural or even urban scale. It reminded me a lot about Hans Hollein's work in the 60s and 70s, you know, and his thesis, as it were, was Alles ist Architektur, everything is architecture. And the issue of Bau magazine that like contained that thesis was chock full of these collages where he took everyday objects, everyday stuff, right? A lipstick, an aircraft carrier is really famous, all kinds of everyday objects, and he just kind of transposed them into like these sort of massive landscapes, right? As if to suggest that what makes architecture is not the kind of built environment per se, but the way we think about stuff and the way we think about stuff, the way we perceive it, and the way we represent it is what makes it architecture, right?
Yeah, I guess during my research, I was also looking at like James Wine, because material is a big part for my pieces. So I was looking at how, you know, his best stores, how they're like a very literal, you know, like the translation from like the bricks that are like breaking apart, but how mine is kind of different, as they're not like a very direct translation, but it is at the same time.
Well, you know, wines is an interesting example. I think. Well, let's talk about this little model here first, right? I like this one because it's so dynamic. It changes. You've got these little heart-shaped kind of peanuts that kind of pop out of it. This sort of felt, and I keep coming back to this one because Of all the models that you put together, this one seems to be like the most resistant to its reading as a kind of like scaled down analog architecture, but at the same time, it also contains within it a sort of like clear architectural proposition. Like maybe these are rooms, maybe they're spaces, maybe they're programs. It has a kind of diagrammatic quality, which I think is fiercely architectural, but at the same time, the felt, the packing peanut, the binder clip, make it a sort of, a thing unto itself, which is really remarkable.
Right. I guess I have a series of like study models like that with like stuff inside the in and out kind of relationship. Not also it's kind of fascinating for me with like all the programs that can be fit into that can be assigned to something very unusual or unusual.
Now we just met yesterday and just talked for the first time yesterday
Yeah.
and had our first detailed conversation this morning. But I wonder, like you've been in this program for 3 years, right? Has your work evolved in this direction over the course of those 3 years? Is this a recent phenomenon?
I guess for my vertical studio for my last 2 years, especially with Runze, we've been trying to investigate how just like the everyday kind of toy and stuff, we're asked to go to just Home Depot to buy a lot of things that I see as a potential for like a thing, and then we just put everything there like with an arrangement like a collage, and then vacuum form it, and that kind of like just like you don't really design or arrange, but just using a vacuum form as like a top-down thing to create form kind of also leads me to this project for my thesis.
Yeah, I remember seeing Peta and Bloom did a studio at Yale last year. This is the first time I kind of experienced a sort of, the totalizing effect of the vacuum form on the kind of conglomeration or assemblage of like everyday objects that the students had collected. And I think it's a really kind of provocative way to think about form. I wonder though, do you see it as a way in to kind of practice later, or is this something you're going to put in your back pocket as a kind of like technique? Is it a set of operations that you think has application in practice? Or are you just going to kind of like, move off in an entirely different direction?
Ideally, I want to, keep some of the design strategy to carry on to my work kind of place. I'm not sure if I have the opportunity to do that, but eventually, I do hope that kind of, that just like whatever kind of, create form from everyday life can be used as a tool in real architectural world.
Yeah. Well, I think you mentioned the word form again, and the vacuum forming, the kind of assemblage is a way of finding the kind of total form. I think, for me, what's most important about this work and what's most interesting is actually the fact that it's not just about form finding. It is a way of developing formal complexity, a certain type of formal complexity, but it's so chock full of associations, right? And which, for me, your project, and this is why it was maybe, maybe the reason I thought it felt a little flat when it made the leap to kind of like architecture, capital A architecture, was precisely because it seemed more about, this model is not just about your project, there goes another peanut, it's about like all architectural models, right? It's about the sort of, the illusion that we buy into that the architectural model is a scaled down analog of like full-size buildings, right? So this for me is the architectural model. It exists both as a kind of proposition about something in the future, something it refers to something beyond itself, and at the same time it is like fiercely kind of autonomous as a thing unto itself, right? Right. Well, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Well, on-camera handshake. Thanks so much. Thanks to SCI-Arc for having me. It's been a real treat. All right.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Hi, my name is At.Namik Mackic, and I'm with Alessio and Runze. If you can present yourself.
Yeah, I can start and then say. So I'm Alessio. I'm an MRQ1 student from SCI-Arc, and I come from Italy, Politecnico Milan. And I can say that my interest and related to this thesis has been always about media technologies, in particular augmented reality. And we invest so much time in working with this media. I can also say that like my undergrad, it's been totally different from SCI-Arc. So I have a core in education in architecture that totally it's been disrupted by the presence of SCI-Arc in my education. And I guess we both share this quality, and we arrived to this point in a very nice scenario, let's say. Yeah.
My name is Runze, and I'm a Mark II student, and I come from Shanghai. So I always interested in dealing with the real-time technologies and how you deal with physical and digital at the same time. Yeah, so this thesis pretty much fulfill our full ambition, yeah, before I came here. Yeah.
So I just want to say, myself, I'm assistant professor at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design, and I teach in the Master of Architecture sequence, precisely the core studio at the moment where the students encounter the urban scale, or the complexity of the urban project. And I find that, I find that your project yesterday, or your thesis, had a way of kind of pushing a lot of hot buttons almost randomly, but I know that it was much more studied than that. And I wanted to catch two things that I am personally very interested in my work, and that I thought you were addressing or framing in an interesting way, is the way that technology re-territorializes space, meaning that it kind of inscribes new patterns or protocols for experience, perception, and of course also use of space. And then another question is this, the future of collective form. And you can take it as a kind of strict typological question of Fumihiko Maki sort of investigations of collective form, both as a group form, something more vernacular, more kind of bottom-up, or something that is more studied as a kind of as a compositional principle for architecture. So could you speak a little bit to this fragmentation of public space that you are displaying in your work? So what we saw yesterday, we don't have this illustration now, but we saw this beautiful model of different public spaces in LA, or rather spaces in front of huge murals executed on various walls across Los Angeles, which then by virtue of having some kind of void or open plaza in front of them become spaces for interaction, both between prospective users or players of these games of deletion, which was the name of their thesis, but also between them and the built environment, where then these images that we were seeing on the walls or the murals acted as, in a way, trackers, or maybe you can explain a little bit more about how that was, how this project kind of came to embody this, or came to exemplify this play with typology, or play with architectural sort of solids in the city.
You can start and you go more like in detail. Let's say that when we started, the first thing that let us fragment the city is the fact that murals are not everywhere. And murals, as we reminded yesterday during the review, are a perfect anchor for any sort of augmented reality content, and it's more reliable than any GPS device or position around the city. Because if we think about Uber as a service, it's sometimes very not reliable. There are some lag. The car maybe is not actually in the same position. Instead, like murals are a physical key toward another dimension, and they are not moving, they are there. So you need to be in presence of a mural for activating the experience itself. For the discussion that relates more to the urban condition of Los Angeles, we wanted to create a different system to understand information that was related much more to the individual person and the sites, rather than a flattening of information as can be, for example, a map. So we disregard any horizontal system, and we just flipped this system 90 degrees. So with the murals, we arrived to have a sort of verticality that is much stronger for an instantaneous quality than an accidental quality that we were looking for.
Yeah, because we were thinking about Before, like the internet kind of connect people rather than spatial proximity. But now with this AR technology, you are bringing people back through machine vision in the proximity of sites. So I feel like the AR technology has this power to, it's kind of like another personality of yourself. It's like you are separate your vision from your physical body to a machine, and then you're interacting with them in the proximity of site together. So it's like this kind of duplication of your self and interacting with people at the same time in the site with space. So I think it's something more interesting, and I want people to experience this kind of quality in the real time. Yeah.
But just to clarify one thing, the way that the project works in very simple terms is that it's an interface that is embodied in an app which enables players in these games of deletion to interact with these urban surfaces and basically either remove them through the principle of subtraction and sort of reveal what lies behind the building, so in a way annulling the architectural mass, the building mass, or to recombine them, to play around with them and maybe even construct new compositions. So I was wondering how the two of you, coming from very different places, you from Italy, you from Shanghai, and arriving in LA with this very particular kind of urban condition and history as well. How did, having studied in this city, not only at SCI-Arc as a school, as a very particular kind of institution, but also coming to this city with your particular sets of urban experiences or agendas, how did it influence your maturation towards this project?
Well, for sure, LA is totally, I mean, I speak for myself in Italy. Italy, like, it's very, I can say the aesthetic of the city is very common. In every city you can find a part of another city. I can say that there is a kind of redundant style. It makes you also comfortable because when you go to any city in Italy, you see like this sort of cuts that belongs probably to the Renaissance or medieval city. You probably can understand perfectly what it means being in a center, being in a plaza, and being outside of the city. I found this that could be impossible in America. In LA especially, there are some some blocks that change totally the aesthetic from, I don't know, 1 mile to another mile. There is no any hierarchy. There is no any reference. So this is just, I think that this is the example that demonstrates the fragmentation that maybe we are talking about, because our model is being composed by fragments of the city that are following all this north orientation. So they are put in a certain rotation for a reason, but still it's very fragmented. There is no relation between these places. And I think this is, at least for my experience here in US so far, I can sense that it's something very American. This sort of, you go here and this place looks totally different than another blocks. Like there is the Art District, East LA, North Hollywood. They're totally different scenarios that they change 100%. So this can be relevant in the analysis.
How does it compare to Shanghai, or what Shanghai has undergone in the last 10, 15 years?
Yeah, Shanghai is when I first time came to LA, I feel like it's very different because in Shanghai you don't need to have a personal public transportation, for example, cars or something, because the public transportation is very convenient. It's like you can travel everywhere without taking any Uber or anything. But now here, LA is like the distance between each block, and it's like very long, so you need a car to travel around the city. Yeah, I feel like, but that's also something interesting, because if you don't have a car or anything, you're kind of walking through this community, and you can experience with those murals accidentally. So it's kind of like the distance and the time you're traveling between those blocks let you have those very unique experience. So I feel like that's also something we can work on for the specific situation in LA. Yeah, and also because I came in from Shanghai, and now, because Shanghai is still at this stage like a lot of projects going on, and so we're still talking about how to design space for people, like to let them experience differently. But somehow, I feel like when I was in school, there was always this kind of problem. So, for example, you design a public space for people, and some people just don't use those public space, and then in turn they will gather at some space very differently than architects thought. So I feel like maybe we should first look at the city. For example, those travelers, those people, they were taking picture in front of murals, and they will have some certain behaviors in front of those spaces. So maybe we can take advantage of those elements in the situation already existed in the city, and working with them and try to bring things to a different level. Yeah.
I think that's a very insightful and a very optimistic kind of approach to how to conceptualize or reconceptualize what constitutes the public in a city, so seemingly antithetical to the idea of the public. Like it's like LA would be the opposite of the Italian square, right? And the way that we yesterday were reading your model, at first it looked kind of as this sort of fragmented or almost like a ruined polis, which was just fragmented into a lot of discrete places, or rather cutouts of sort of different blocks, etc. But together it constitutes like a new field, like you said, city as a field of objects, and to pull together this field of objects as the beginning of a different kind of, a new maybe notion of the public sphere, and using behavior using the tendency for people to kind of contort their behavior to, or rather submit it to the way that media provoke us to behave. I think that's a very kind of optimistic and very, in a way, young way to look at something that has been reiterated as an almost insurmountable problem. Where are you taking the project from here?
Well, we are thinking for sure to keep going with this project in some way. Maybe not toward this deletion aspect. Still, we don't know. We need to figure out if we want to go to more a marketing scenario, but always keeping this spatial elements condition. I can sense that, as you said, like this new vision of the space implies digitalization that also affect how we are thinking about urban spaces, because when we are thinking in terms of there are fragments of the city, is a little bit when we are like on internet and we actually don't follow any perfect linear path. We just go here, here, and here. That's subconsciously to me what's now happening in architecture. We have a city, we have spots, but we highlight just only what we need, like in our life, in our daily routine. And that's probably what we will take in consideration. Like Runze said right now, if people gather in front of a mural, there is a reason why they are doing it. It means this graphic content that is being digitally designed is affecting the physical very much. So the project starts for sure there. There is a good chance that the project starts there. There are all the requirements for it. But still, like, there are so many other applications of it. And the fact that you can interface spaces and having deletions let you see somewhere where you couldn't see before. That's the game changer to me.
So revealing the kind of urban balances behind the mural is also part of the game.
Yeah.
Can you explain why this for you is a game and not let's say, a planning tool?
Yeah, so the reason why we first put this as a game is because we were thinking, so during the review some people asked, is it just about entertaining or something? we would say like entertainment is like the start point. So it's like a gesture to let you feel interested first. So it's also to us it's the starting point. So because we feel interested that way. And then starting from there, I feel like it can go more serious. For example, like we can dealing with more the content that being revealed. And is it just the interface or it's like a nesting of world to be deleted in the vertical way? So like challenging the traditional idea of this horizontality of the digital map system already existing in human mindset. Yeah, I feel like it can go multiple directions and we need to do a lot of research after SCI-Arc.
Would you say that, you said that entertainment becomes the starting point, or the act of being entertained is for you almost like a drawer, like a magnet for people to engage in the game.
Yeah.
Would you say that the pleasure of that sort of, the lightness of not demolition, but reconstruction is something that you also are kind of cultivating as an architectural value, to the fact that there should be a kind of a greater sense of playfulness in engagement with what has been kind of what we have inherited in terms of the urban fabric?
I feel like it's more like one of them is like the, I don't know, maybe it's like a, for me it's like a deep emotional need. It's like architects are always like, you know, kind of playing God, like wanna dealing with things in a very arbitrary way, but also very playful way. And in that way, it's like this technology in this game enabled us to have some really influential and powerful moves around the city, and to bring things and bring people together. Yeah.
And also the fact that you remove like buildings, that you remove part of the buildings from somewhere, and you have the power to recompose it and leave it there, that someone else can see it after it. I think that's the main connection between one user and the next user. Yeah. So that where it becomes interface almost. But when they asked like it's just entertainment, even if it might be only entertainment, but entertainment is a very important sector in the economy. Yeah. It's very relevant. Above all in LA, it's super active. So I don't see any negative aspect saying that it might be just entertainment, because entertainment means a lot of things actually.
So in this conceptualization of this multi-user game or multi-user interface that you're creating or proposing, have you been thinking of, there was a conversation yesterday at the review that was about to what extent it is necessary to, I mean, there are technological reasons, practical reasons why you're using murals as the information on which to kind of latch onto. But we were also talking about whether or not it would be possible to somehow, in one way or another, inhabit the operations, or somehow invest some kind of personal meaning or intention into the operations that are being made, that are maybe outside of the pure, let's say, indifference of game playing. But there was another thing that I was thinking of now when you were talking about this, which is whether or not it could be a trajectory to explore for users to kind of deposit some kind of information in the, or the leaders, as you're calling them, in the operations that they do with the blocks, with the murals. That there's a sense of, like graffiti artists do, they have a signature. It's a form of territorial marking. Is there a way that there can be a kind of a gesture or a procedure of information depositing, or some kind of intention building, or some kind of architecture of intent, if you like, that is happening as a kind of collective, cumulative process through the game?
I think when we were brainstorming for the game in the first moment, we thought this game as a system that were like a lot of gamers in this platform, more or less like a conventional system of games where you always know who's the best. There is a chart, then it's constantly updated, and you see who's the first, who's the second, what's the score, And we thought in this way in a first moment, and that becomes totally a game, much more than a platform. But still, it's sort of hybrid in between these two things. So what we wanted to do at the first moment also was like how we can affect the physical space and just declare that that is a part of the city where people can leave their signature freely, virtually, imposing themselves in a dimension that is not a physical one in a first moment. So we thought about having like a tribune or something like a stadium, for example, outside of these empty areas, because most of them are empty areas, most of them are parking lots. So it's always like a huge space in front of them. And if we're gonna go step by step, the signature that I see right now in the context of the game, in this project, is like having the possibility to say, I choose what to stream in this content, because the composition of the scene implies to have a texture that you probably decide what's the material you're gonna put on there. And then you can put there any sort of place you want. And that can declare what actually is your signature and what you want to show to everyone else in a common channel that can be games of deletion.
Yeah. And I feel like at the first moment when we're thinking about this project, we also think about, for example, different users and different, let's say players. They will put those digital content everywhere at different places. And so if we can collect those objects they're placing there and try to find a system to organize them, and it becomes like a matrix of those. So for example, it's kind of like a matrix of digital archiving. So it's like but in 3-dimensionality. So when you go to for example, one specific place, and then you can just pull out all those information. For example, I want to say, what are the 20s playing here and what the results of those games? And then we can say, for example, what are, let's say, people above age of 50 and what's the result of those. So it's kind of like a archiving system in space, but you can pull out all those informations like a digital channel in space. So I feel like that's something will be more systematic and will become, it's like a different kind of interaction, in space.
One last question to conclude. The last theme that you brought up, this sort of sense of data collection and maybe even analysis of the way that you can extract from the data that accumulate from the game being played by many users. How do you retain control or avoid that kind of data to be abused? Or is there a way of using it in a kind of critical way in order to maybe suggest new trajectories for public sort of formation of urban space or collective formation of space? Or how do you kind of how do you as designers take control of the data and make sure that it's used to some kind of progressive or positive end?
I think that the data collection, it's been something that came with us from the beginning of this project, because every time that you're dealing with making an application and you are talking about players and users and you have someone else that will use what you're doing, you go for any chance you have, you are gathering data in some way, because you're seeing people doing something with your platform. So architecture, in my opinion, should take really in consideration the fact that we can gather data that are not like maybe email or something else that maybe social network are used to do, but the same impact and strength can be in this design data that we are gathering. Because if like the 50% of the players of this game are making a composition rather than another one, or are interfacing a space rather than another one. So let's say, to make a very simple example, like if we see that 50 players a day want to interface a city like Rome in Italy, and you see a great desire of these American Los Angeles citizens to see Rome in their city, that tells you something. You know, that tells you that there is someone that wants to be there and feel the need to be connected to this other space, and you can invest money as a urban planner or as a urban factors in Los Angeles to say, next project we're going to do, we're going to go in that direction, and we probably will find some sort of connecting with the city much more. It's just a new way to think, to me, in terms of instantaneous connection and visual connection that can literally change the aspect of the city, probably. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Graham Harman. I teach philosophy here at the Southern California Institute of Architecture, better known as SCI-Arc. And with me here today is Andy Magner, who showed his project yesterday. And it's called Enshrouded. And I'll let him tell you about it, but it involves a planned U.S. Embassy for Tokyo. Tell us about the project and what Enshrouded means in this context.
Right. So I'll just start by saying I'm an MArch2 student that just completed my thesis yesterday. And the project was looking at a relationship between two objects, both an exterior volume that would act as a shroud for an interior object which was supposed to have a certain presence. So the idea for the embassy really came about the dichotomy that embassies require between a very public face and a very private government function. So the idea was to take a very thick and solid mass, use that as something that would be acting as a shroud for a public artifact that would be inserted into the shroud and therefore disrupting it, allowing the public to access it.
Now I noticed that you used the shroud for the public parts, whereas the obvious move would have been to shroud the part where the spies hang out in the embassy. What made you decide to do it the other way?
I'm not sure that I would say necessarily that the shroud was exactly one object as the object that was being used for the public. I think for me, shrouding was more used as a verb and less as a noun. It was more the act of hiding certain parts, obfuscating certain parts of the object, and then letting some qualities bleed through. But also some of the characteristics that come out of shrouding, which would be those bleed through moments where you see certain hints of aspects of the project showing up on the outside. Those pieces of the project were the parts that were supposed to be inviting for the public, or give them some hint of something that's going on inside. So I don't know if it's quite as straightforward as saying that one part is the shrouded private and one's the public.
Well, here's what I liked about your decision. Obviously, this has a lot to do with object-oriented ontology and Heidegger and related issues with withdrawal and veiling of objects. Most critics interpret that in purely negative terms, that if something is shrouded, you just can't get at it at all, and it becomes a negative theology. Whereas in O and even in Heidegger, it is a kind of allure, or a seduction even in Baudrillard. And that's why I liked the fact that you associated that more with the public parts.
Right.
Now the reason I thought of it as a kind of a dichotomy is that the upper part of your building, which is supposed to be the secret area, is, as someone would put it, the international style box.
Right, it's generic.
And I wonder, had you thought about making the shift more gradual between the two parts?
I really wanted to accentuate the moment that the building was split open and allowed to be accessed by the public. So I think I was going for a harsher kind of contrast between the two parts of the building. But I'm glad that you picked up on the kind of O aspects of it, because at the beginning of the project, looking at the shroud, it was much more, your first instinct is to say, like, yes, it's like throwing something over an object that obfuscates it, but when you later interpret it more about what kind of qualities you might see through the shroud, it's much less about hiding things and more about only hiding certain parts of it, but letting other components show through. Like in the example that I used of the Shroud of Turin, you would see some aspects of the body are allowed to be seen, while others are totally obfuscated or even competed with by the figure of the shroud itself. So it was a more complex relationship than I think I was thinking about at the start.
Yesterday during your review, I brought up the resonances I found with Tom Wiscombe's essay Towards a Flat Ontology of Architecture. Now, of course, he was your advisor, so I wouldn't be surprised if there was some influence there. Last night at the party, somebody also mentioned Tom Main, the distinguished architect associated with
Two
SCI-Arc,
Toms, yeah.
as also possibly an influence on that project. What would you say?
I would say that's probably true. I had read the article that you mentioned, the Flat Ontology of Architecture, previously, but I reread it after I'd started this project, about halfway through, so I kind of got a different take on it, and it actually did kind of shift how I was thinking about it, because obviously the objects in a sack is somewhat similar to the shrouded project, as you might think of putting something in either a fabric or a cloth, but reading that and then a couple other influences led me to think less about it as a formal project of saying just putting an object in and seeing how something might wrap it, and more as looking at, like I said, less like shroud as a noun, as a cloth thing, more as shroud as a verb of, covering something and showing certain aspects through the shroud. It was kind of a way to hint at the influence, but also kind of separate myself from it a little bit, kind of look at another layer that we might get at.
There was also another Wiscombian aspect of the project, which is the way you raised the embassy above the ground, which Tom also addresses in his article. Was that something else you got from the article, or was that you independently came to that decision?
That was something that I kind of had already in the project, and then I don't recall reading specifically about it in the article, but it was something that Tom, when he'd be looking at it, he'd be like, that needs to not touch so much, or yeah, he'd want to raise it up or something. But
a way of decontextualizing the building.
Right. Well, it was also a lot about the embassy. I mean, the thing wanted to have a small footprint for security reasons, and it wanted to be very secure on the bottom, so the bottom was very thick but touched on a very small footprint to make it easier to secure the entryways. So
I hadn't thought of that. And that brings us to my next question, which is obviously shrouding was tied in this case to a very specific project, the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. Is shrouding something you're interested in more generally, or was this sort of a one-off that was prompted by this particular project?
It was part of a kind of strain of things that I was interested in. It was one term during our thesis prep research that I was interested in, and that kind of got teased out later in the process of the thesis. So I think it's something that I didn't love at the beginning, but I've started to kind of come around to it. It's something that my advisors, both Tom Wiscombe and Marika Trotter, kind of picked up on and told me I might not be looking as much into that, and I should look more into it. So I think now, after I've gotten to know it a lot more, I'm becoming more and more interested in it. And especially, like someone brought up on the project, the model itself turned out a little bit differently than it was supposed to, but it actually had new qualities that I hadn't seen. So the process of making it physical and building the model actually showed a bit more subtle effects that I hadn't thought of before. It was kind of like a reevaluation in the final product that kind of makes me think a little bit differently about how the shrouded qualities might come through.
Because I'm wondering if we move to a different sort of project, one where there wasn't such a demarcation between the secret and the public parts of your design brief, how would the shroud be applied differently in that case? Would it take on a more building-wide function, whereas in this case it was mostly confined to the lower parts?
Right. You mean if we change typologies, like if you say a library or a museum or something?
Or a hotel where all the floors have basically the same function except for the bottom.
I still think that that's another program where it has a very repetitive thing that might want to stay generic, and then you still have a very public aspect of the lobby or the entrance that might still have more focus than the other parts. I don't know if that's just the way that I'm thinking about it now, but I think that, that's one route that I didn't explore, is if you inverse the relationship and gave the more typical programs the emphasis. I think for me, the emphasis was always on where the public would be able to enter an otherwise very private building. That's where I really wanted to build the tension and emphasize the fact that, if in the sake of in the example of the embassy, where it was otherwise a very private government building that the public wouldn't normally have such an emphatic entrance, what would it look like if you did have that? Which is, why I chose to emphasize that part. Yeah, that could be something.
Simply because you found a way to employ the shroud for inviting rather than simply withholding.
Right.
And so I was wondering if even as extreme a case as a government building. I mean, obviously any government buildings that are rebuilt in the United States will still be built neoclassical, I'm sure. But let's say things were more imaginative. Let's say Trump's complaints about the White House being infested with cockroaches and flies finally hit home, and they decided to rebuild the White House. And you were hired as the architect for the White House, and they specifically wanted some shrouding. Crazy question. I just wonder how you would apply it to something like that.
I still think I would go at it in saying that there might be a new aspect of the White House where it's never something that the public is allowed to walk up to. I think that would be where I would introduce something like that, because you're right, I am using the shroud as a way to not withhold something from somebody, but to withhold certain parts and then give them a hint that would act as a lure to bring them in. So I still think I might approach it in that way, and then I don't know, it might be tongue-in-cheek to say that the generic, more stark and featureless aspects of the building would be where the government kind of stronghold is, but
I'd like to know who your favorite architects are, whether living or dead. Who are the people you took as a model?
As people picked up on, Tom Main,
All right.
Orifice is definitely one of my favorites.
Any who are less close to home?
Jose Ubre was a very early influence for me.
What about his work?
I got to visit one of his buildings early on, and I was really struck by the handmade, crafted qualities and the kind of very specific tectonic aspects of the buildings that he had, and just the way that the whole building comes together as a component of pieces, which I think came through on my project. It's very much about an assembly of pieces, was always something that I was interested in. And I think, as you mentioned, the Tom Main influence was pretty obvious at certain points.
Tom Wiscombe was just talking in the review I was just on about the generational aspects of architecture. That in some ways you're learning from the generation of your teachers, you're also resisting that generation. Is there anything you've noticed in yourself and in others about a different direction in which you want to take architecture compared to what you're seeing from your teachers? You're graduating now, so you can say this on film.
Two things. One thing that we brought up earlier was, after reading the Tom Wiscombe piece, there were certain parts that I saw myself going down that I didn't necessarily want to be associated with.
Okay.
Like I didn't want to just further the same thing, so I kind of distanced myself from some things that I read in that article. And then also, as you might know, within SCI-Arc, there are a couple kind of camps. And
How would you
look,
describe
we talked about the new POMO camp that might be disappearing or might be still going strong, but that I definitely wanted to distance myself from that a little bit by making my building all black, no color, very stark. I'd say that's one thing that I'm definitely...
Kind of modernist reminiscences in order to combat POMO. I've thought about this too in the context of Mark Foster Gage at Yale, who some people will also say is POMO because you've seen his designs. He reminds me more of Gothic somehow.
Yeah, I think so too.
And so I think POMO might be the wrong reaction to that kind of style.
I might not have said POMO either.
Yeah, but there is some POMO around. I've seen several, especially undergraduate programs that have projects that have done very well here in the last few years. I would describe as POMO, and I think some people at SCI-Arc are worried about that because they see themselves as furthering the modernist camp.
Yeah, I think SCI-Arc's definitely been a place where multiple things can go on at the same time. And I wouldn't like to think that one thing might be able to take over, but I can definitely see the recent proliferation of the POMO camp. It's definitely something that I haven't been a part of, but I've gained appreciation for it since I've been here. That's definitely for sure.
It could mean either of two things. It could mean that architecture is spinning its wheels, or it could mean that POMO is not exhausted yet and it has lessons to teach the people who have not assimilated.
Right.
As they say, lessons are repeated until learned.
Right, or it's reintroduced in a new context. I mean, even though it hasn't been that long, but I think a lot of stuff is very reactionary, especially in SCI-Arc. I mean, SCI-Arc defines itself very clearly through its social media or recent projects. People start to characterize it as like, it used to be the place for all the parametricism and the very digital projects. So I think that's partially why the POMO stuff is coming back. People don't want to be associated with one thing, so they might introduce something like that.
And then there's the Deleuzianism still around. I understand Sanford Quinter is going to be teaching a class with some anti-triple-O aspects.
I didn't know that.
This semester, yes.
That's very interesting.
And Sanford's a wonderful character, so I look forward to debating that with him if I get the chance.
Yeah.